Reconstructing philosophy. Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 2 of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. I'm Matt Silk, and joining me for this next episode is Dr. Phil Bériault from the University of Waterloo. Phil has philosophical interests in analytic metaphysics, fictionalism, ethics, and political philosophy, and he recently defended his thesis, All the World's a Stage, Fictionalism, Metaphysics, and Truth. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah. So this is now the second episode of the podcast. We're chugging along at a good pace. But in the first one, we talked about the lockdown that was just first starting. Before we jump into it, I just want to ask you, how are you managing the lockdown?
Well, I spent a lot of it finishing my dissertation, so I guess I always had that to work on, although I don't think that's something that many graduate students are going to sympathize with. But after finishing my dissertation, I just took a bit of a break and got started on the usual stuff that I guess a young researcher gets started to, job applications and thinking about next research steps, and yeah.
That's good. I mean, the thing is, it's in the lockdown, it can be kind of tricky because, the days kind of start to blend together and, you're reading stuff, but it's, it's like I was talking about with Ian last time, sometimes it really helps to get another set of eyes or ears on it. And also, like, just during this whole thing, it's good to be able to showcase your work and let other philosophers nearby hear your work so any methods of coping with this, I suppose this is part of my method is by creating a show. But your interests are in metaphysics and fictionalism. Briefly, what are you working on right now?
Well, so I'm looking at the future prospects for what was of my dissertation research. So in my dissertation, I proposed a sort of alternative account to fictionalism than what is typically pursued. Namely, I proposed it as a kind of semantic anti-realism rather than as an error theory. I'm looking at the prospects of such a view to try to think about structural realism in the philosophy of math and philosophy of science. So I think I've got a pretty compelling account of fictionalism, and I'm just trying to see how far I can take it right now.
Sounds interesting. So why mathematical fictionalism? Why did you get into this field?
Well, that's kind of a weird and long story.
Well, that's what the podcast is for.
Yeah,
weird and long stories.
No, for sure. I originally started my PhD in the hopes of trying to actually pursue something more in the light of metaethics to relate to political philosophy. I had just finished my master's thesis trying to argue for a particular account of philosophical anarchism, and I was kind of hoping and thinking, well, I'm somebody with a lot of metaethical curiosities, and I thought, well, it'd be neat to try to think of how to think of metaethical commitments that could support the sort of things that I was arguing in my master's thesis. And so, as part of my PhD at U Waterloo, as you know, we have to do research areas, and so I did the first one in political philosophy, and I had to do another research area, and it had to be in a different area of philosophy. And so I figured, well, fictionalism in metaphysics is often very relevant to metaethics, and I figured it'd be a good opportunity to contrast, at the time, my inability to understand the distinction between fictionalism and constructivism, and I thought doing a research area in just looking at fictionalist metaphysics and constructivist metaphysics could help sort of further my metaethical reflections. Um, that research area was supervised by David Davidi, and in the process of doing that, we discussed mathematical fictionalism, and that was largely because it involved a particular theory of fictionalism developed by Kendall Walton that I was familiar with, but also it seemed to be a particularly compelling development of fictionalism generally. And so I ended up writing a paper entitled A Non-Error Theory Approach to Mathematical Fictionalism that I presented at a conference for the Society for the Research and History in the Philosophy of Mathematics, the Canadian C. Sherpum, right? I actually invited Mary Lang to come sit at that talk, which was very interesting because it was a response to one of her papers. And I got some really positive feedback, I think, from that paper. And I was really happy with that paper. And it was a natural jumping off spot for a really interesting dissertation. And so I not to make light of it too much, I think I deserve some credit, but that Calvin and Hobbes comic where Calvin kind of stumbles and he kind of falls at the end and he goes, ta-da, right? I do really think that in many ways I kind of stumbled in way of philosophical reflection into this dissertation topic, because it was certainly not what I was expecting when I began my PhD.
Well, that's one of the more interesting things about philosophy, is how easy it is to sort of start off thinking you really want to do one thing and you end up doing something completely different. And yet at the same time, it's interesting because there's still connections between the two, right? Like there's still connections between the fictionalism that you're doing and the kind of ethics, the meta-ethical issues. We'll talk about those later, I suppose. Yep. But what got you into philosophy in the first place?
Well, I suppose, unlike a lot of kids, I guess now, there wasn't philosophy when I was in high school. At least the school board was, I think, still at that point, still experimenting with the prospect, and so not all schools had yet. I went to a Catholic school in Ontario here, and so my school at that time didn't have philosophy courses. But what I did have was this. I think it was a world religions class. And the teacher for that class had a one class where I think a philosophy student from the university came to give a talk. I think it was about Descartes. And that was, I guess, maybe the first instance where I was like, oh, this philosophy stuff is pretty interesting. But then what really, really got me into it was in my first year of university. I was originally enrolled in political science. And I was, at the time, I had no idea about various disciplines and their niche studies and how to best pursue what I was thinking of in my head and how to name that in the course calendar, right? And so I was in a program, political science, specializing in political theory. And as part of my first year, I was in a first-year seminar in ethics. And that course was, to me, much more reflective of the sort of questions that I was curious about and what I wanted to think about and what I wanted to continue learning about than what I was getting from my intro to poli-sci class. So that was a class with Gordon Davis from Carleton University there, and it was a really it was a really eye-opening class for me to know that there could be a whole degree that I could pursue where I could thoughtfully reflect on things, and where I thought that could be, not shunned or not looked down upon as meandering, or to be told that getting into semantics is bad, or
Sure. You had to wait until you try to publish for that. Yeah. So you mentioned that you're doing mathematical fictionalism and talking about truth within mathematics. Can you talk about and explain your current research in a bit more detail?
Yeah. So mathematical fictionalism is often developed as a kind of defense of error theory. That is typically a lot of people, or a lot of anti-realists, mathematical anti-realists, are committed to the notion that since mathematical objects, or such as functions or numbers or sets, don't actually exist, are the things we say about them aren't true, right? And much in the same way we might think that, since ghosts don't exist, the things that I say about ghosts can't be true, right? The issue at this point, though, is to explain how something that is in large part not true, or not in the business of being true, can still be so applicable and can still be so effective for accomplishing, a great deal of pretty amazing things. And so fictionalism is the attempt to offer that explanation, to explain how it is mathematics can be useful, despite the fact that it is not actually, as typically understood by many mathematical physicists, not typically in the business of actually being true or giving true assertions. And so my research is largely motivated by the fact, or the idea, that much of the work that many mathematical fictionalists have done to provide this account of the usefulness of mathematics provides for us an alternative semantics for mathematical assertions. So rather than just see these really compelling, so for example, Mary Ling and Stephen Yablo both have very compelling, I think, accounts of, or fictionalist developments of, the applicability of mathematics. And I think rather than just see that as an account of the applicability of mathematics, or see their accounts as an account of the applicability of mathematics, as seeing them as providing the actual semantic truth conditions for the assertions in question, which is to say, for mathematics.
One thing I want to, maybe before we go further, just to those who are relatively uninitiated, why is it that the truth of mathematical claims is problematic? Why is it that for philosophers the truth of mathematical claims is problematic?
Certainly. Well, I mean, I guess this is tied to what is probably one of the most popular, not only philosophically, but even also potentially intuitively, accounts of truth, right? And this is roughly something like the correspondence theory of truth, or what I would prefer to call the representational semantics account of truth. And what this is, well, the things we say that are either true or false, our assertions, the assertions we make, well, they are true or false depending on how accurately they represent the things that they're supposed to represent. So, for example, if I were to hold up this can of beer that I have, and I were to say, try to speak something true of it or not, right? This can of beer is a James Ready. Well, what makes that true or false is whether or not the thing that I am holding is actually a can of James Ready beer. If it's not the case, well, then it's not true. Now, the issue with the difference between talking about cans of beer and talking about mathematics is that it's pretty easy to make a commitment to the reality of the can of beer. What is not so easy to make it to provide to accept the reality of is abstract objects. And on the face of it, if we accept, for instance, that all assertions are true depending on how they represent things that are out there, well, then that supposedly would be true of mathematical assertions as well. But now we're talking about trying to represent abstract objects and not, say, medium-sized objects that we interact with on a daily basis. And so for a lot of people who don't really like the idea of appealing to the reality of abstract objects, well, if they also accept that sentences or assertions are in the business of representing things, then it looks like they're forced to accept the conclusion that the things they say are not true about those things. So this is the example I gave earlier about talking about ghosts, right? Suppose I'm somebody who just does not believe in ghosts. I think the notion of their existence is ridiculous, but it doesn't really matter why I think ghosts don't exist, right? Now, suppose you now come up to me and say things like, my house is haunted by 3 ghosts. Or, Phil, if 2 ghosts interact with each other, they create a new ghost. And things like this, and you make assertions like this to me. Well, if I don't believe in ghosts, I'm going to say the things you're saying aren't true.
Do you believe in ghosts? I do. And you will too.
And I'm going to say that they're not true precisely because there are no ghosts. I might even be a little bit more stronger about this. I might say, not only are they not true, they can't possibly be true. Right? It's not even close to it. Now, the issue for mathematics, when you think about mathematics this way, is let's imagine and suppose that talking about ghosts was actually really helpful for us. Suppose talking about ghosts helped us, let's say, land a rover on Mars and then fly a drone around on the planet's surface, right? Well, now we might say to me, Phil, come on. If ghosts don't exist, then explain the use, and these things we're saying about them aren't true, then explain to me how I can use this talk to accomplish these tasks. And so this is the precise conundrum, or the precise dilemma that faces mathematical anti-realists, which is to say, philosophers who would reject the reality of the sorts of abstract objects or entities that mathematics would seem to refer to.
Yeah, it seems so. It seems like part of the issue is, when you say something that's supposed to represent something in the world, well, you don't see the number 5 out there. You don't trip over the number 5 in the world. So how can you say anything that's true that would represent or correspond to that? And without that, how can we say anything that is true about numbers or about mathematics? And yet mathematics seems to be so helpful. So how can they be true? And how can they possibly be useful?
Right.
And so your way of responding to that is to say that they're not true in the sense that we talk about things out in the world, but that they're a different kind of truth, right?
Yeah,
in a way.
Precisely. Well, not just in a way. I mean, I am. This is not part of the stuff I sort of helped you get ready for this talk, but I am an alethic pluralist, which is to say, I'm committed to the idea that there are many different kinds of truth. And in particular, I think what would be different domains of discourse will have different truth conditions. So, for example, mathematics would be one domain of discourse, and it has particular truth conditions that are specific to it. I argue that those truth conditions are fictionalist ones, and in particular that the sort of Waltonian accounts offered by Yablo and Leng do more than offer an account of the usefulness of the mathematics. They provide precisely that alternative semantics, that alternative non-representational semantics. It's wrong to think of the semantics of mathematics as in the business of representation.
I can already imagine a number of people being a bit confused, right? How can something be fictionally true?
Well, I'm just calling it mathematically true.
Sure,
right?
but I mean, like Walton has this account of what it mean, how
Right.
something can still
Precisely.
be true within
Yeah.
a fiction. So
This really stems from a particular development of a philosophical dilemma in the philosophy of fiction that at first has nothing to do with mathematics, which is a really interesting point if we're trying to develop this idea that different questions can lead us in different directions. If I were to say to you something like, Frodo is secretly Spider-Man, right? And I say, compare that to the sentence, Peter Parker is secretly Spider-Man. Well, a lot of us might be inclined to say that the latter assertion, the one about Peter Parker being Spider-Man, is in some sense true. And on top of that, that the assertion about Frodo being secretly Spider-Man is in some sense false, right? Putting it really simply, there's an idea that because one coheres with this story that we know about, it is in a sense true. However, if we're the sorts of anti-realists that many fictionalists might be, well, how can that be? How can that be true in any sense at all? And the latter, the assertion about Frodo being Spider-Man will still be false, but it'll be false for now an entirely different reason than the one we had before. And so there's this sort of dilemma and this question in the philosophy of fiction of trying to provide this account of truth, right? This sort of way of explaining this intuition we have that Peter Parker is secretly Spider-Man is true, while Frodo is secretly Spider-Man is false. And Walton proposed what is a make-believe account of fiction, what is sometimes called a pretense theory, to try to explain for us, or try to offer an explanation for how it is we can think of these sorts of assertions being true or false. And essentially what it is we situate these sorts of assertions in a kind of make-believe and a kind of active pretend that we're all engaged in. And so the easiest way to think about this is to provide a game of make-believe. And in this case, I'm going to use the example of Cops and Robbers rather than Walton's own example of Mud Pies, because I think Cops and Robbers is a more accessible example for more people. Now, we have a group of kids playing Cops and Robbers, and we can imagine that while they're playing, they make a variety of assertions. Things like the bag of loot is in the safe, there are 3 cops guarding the bank, there will be several witnesses as we make our escape, so on and so forth. The getaway car is parked around the corner. Now, literally speaking, we might say again, well, none of these things that these kids are saying are true, right? A bag of Monopoly money in a lunchbox is not really a bag of loot in a safe, right? 3 kids guarding the garage is not really 3 cops guarding a bank. The adults on their front lawns are not going to be witnesses to a literal crime. And the cardboard box down the street is not a getaway car. Nevertheless, Walton thinks that we can understand these things as being fictionally true because of the role because of how they help to make sense and play and navigate the make-believe. So we begin with what would be considered imaginarily true for Walton. And this is just acts of imagination that were stipulated to make, right? That the bag of Monopoly money is loot, for instance, right? That this is a bag of loot will be imaginarily true. However, and more significantly, there are what's called make-believedly true assertions. And make-believedly true assertions are assertions that are true not just in virtue of an act of imagination, but also in virtue of some fact about the thing that's serving as the vehicle for our imagination. So, for example, it can be imaginarily true in a game of Cops and Robbers, let's say, that the bag of Monopoly money is a bag of loot, and that the lunchbox is a safe. But that alone won't be enough for the assertion the bag of loot is in the safe to be true or not. In order for that to be true, it has to be the case that the things that are serving as our vehicles of our imagination, the bag of Monopoly money, is actually in the lunchbox, right? And so in this sense, what is make-believedly true is in some sense independent of the players, right? And their acts of imagination. They also have to reflect what Walton calls the props of our make-believe. And so this is how we make sense of the truth of the assertions that we started when we began discussing our make-believe. There will be 3 cops guarding the bank. Well, if the props are such that make it make-believedly true, it will be true. But it's important to also note that Walton discusses not just the importance of props in helping us understand what is make-believedly true, but also the role that principles of generation playing. And the principles of generation are going to be sort of what he would formally call conditional statements, which prescribe certain acts of imagination and certain rules of our make-believe, as it were. So
it sort of structures the thinking within fictional, like within a fictional narrative, it sort of structures and becomes the framework upon which we talk about that framework, right?
Right. So, for instance, if we had a rule in our game of cops and robbers where if a cop touched a robber on the shoulder, well, that meant that robber was now under arrest, right? Well, that rule has impacts on what will be true within the game of make-believe or not, right? If one of the children make-believing engaged in the imaginary true assertion that they are a cop, uses their prop, in this case their hand, in order to grab one of the other children who is playing a robber on the shoulder, well, now the assertion, "you're under arrest," is true.
I think it's important. I think it's important too for people who aren't, because when you build that framework, it means that when the assertions that you make aren't just literal, they're not just literal make believe. You're not just making things up on the fly, right? It's rule guided. It's norm oriented.
Right.
Assertions within a fictional framework, right?
Yeah. So right. Assertions that are make believedly true in virtue of their dependence on both facts about the props that we're using to help facilitate our make-believe, as well as their dependence on the principles of generation, which will be the rules of our make-believe. The truth of these assertions are in many ways independent of the players. And
that seems to be important, because then that way, when I say something that's make-believedly true, I'm not just making it up. I'm stating something that corresponds, or at least reflects something that's independent of just me and what I'm imagining, right?
Right. For instance, if I started, if I just, like in our game of cops and robbers, one of the kids just pulled out a branch and went, zap, you've been fireballed, right? We'd say like, well, no, that's not true. That's not true in our game of make-believe, right?
You're playing it wrong.
To go back to our Calvin and Hobbes, I love Calvin and Hobbes, so I might go back to it a couple of times, right? It doesn't devolve into a game of Calvin ball. It's not nonsense, right? It's deliberate, it's directed, I would say usually in the direction of accomplishing particular tasks. In the game of cops and robbers, it's pretty simple. It's, recreation, it's to have fun, to exercise a child's imagination. But there are lots of things I think that we can direct those sorts of. Oh yeah, for sure. I used to love playing with refrigerator boxes and yeah. One thing I used to do when I was a kid, I remember when it was a windy day, I'd move my hands and swish with the wind in the trees to make it believe that I was like a sorcerer, moving the wind.
Sure.
Yep.
Sure, but you can't make the wind change. So so any assertions you make are going to be guided by the prop being the wind, I suppose, right?
Precisely, right. Right. So none of this is just ad hoc, right? It's not just going along with whatever is convenient. We usually have a particular thing we're trying to accomplish, and we're employing creativity to help us accomplish that. I just happen to think that creativity can accomplish a whole lot of much more fantastic things than simply giving us a fun game of cops and robbers or a fun time out in the wind on a windy day with some trees.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the thing is that being able to talk about assertions within a fictional narrative. I mean, it's important anyways. I mean, even philosophers of language address these. But I mean, the fact that you're using this to sort of talk about math, I think, is what makes it so interesting, right? Because it seems like so. What you're essentially saying then is that math is essentially a made-up fiction that utilizes various props to help it conform to, or at least there's some sort of connection to the real world, such that any assertion made about the fiction still depends upon something external to the knower, right?
Yeah. The chain might get pretty long once we get into pretty developed and more abstract areas of mathematics, and the causal connection there to our props, because well, it's a long story, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but the scaffolding of make-believes on top of make-believes can make things pretty... can add for some interesting developments, and I think we see that in mathematics.
Honestly, I think that's one of the most interesting things that you talk about in the paper is the scaffolding of fictions on top of fictions. It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that to me it plays such a really important part of Yablow's paper, The Myth of the Seven. But he doesn't really seem to draw much attention to it. And to me, I think that's a really significant way of trying to explain the usefulness, or not just necessarily the usefulness, but the development or the purpose, or not even necessarily the purpose, but like how much more developed and abstract areas of mathematics can still ultimately find their root in the sorts of make-believe and the sorts of goals that we would have had when we were developing more applied versions of mathematics. And not only that, but it offers really interesting ways to think about the Russell paradox. And it's odd to me that Yablo doesn't really spend more time on it, but.
So, with your account of mathematical fictionalism, so essentially it seems like what your framework allows for is us to still talk about things being true within math that are within a sort of fictional framework that latch on to an objective reality in some way, such that it can still be very useful to talk about mathematical claims, despite the fact that they may not be real in the same sense that we talk about, I don't know, atoms or chairs or anything else, right?
Yeah, precisely. So, I mentioned earlier that Walton's account of make-believe was not intended as an account of how it is that mathematics is true, or how it is that we can develop fictionalist anti-realisms in other domains other than what he would call the representational arts. Needless to say, it is provided an account that has been of great inspiration to many fictionalists in many domains of philosophical investigation, to try to account for, well, if we're talking about a domain where nothing we're saying is true, but it's still useful for us, well, how do we account for it, right? So Walton's account of theory of make-believe, for instance, gives us an account of why an assertion like the bag of loot is in the safe is useful in order to help me find the bag of Monopoly money, right? That's the purpose with which that game of make-believe provides us with. And to transition that account to other areas where we ask ourselves, well, how can assertions still be useful without being true? Well, we try to explain them in the same way that a make-believe assertion in a game of make-believe can still be useful for something, yet fail to be true. And yeah, the role of props in particular has served a great, and principles of generation have helped many philosophers develop, I think, many compelling fictionalist accounts of the usefulness of various domains of discourse.
So I'd like to ask you about Walton about this in a little bit later. But for now, I want to ask about. I want to clarify a little bit, I guess, what's meant by make-believe in this situation. There's a passage that's mentioned that I thought was kind of interesting. It's the part about the assertion about the city of Crotone, that's in the arc of the Book of Italy.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
Now, what I want to ask about that is so in your paper, for instance, you mentioned that this is false, and I'm wondering if, when we talk about Italy being a boot, it strikes me as being more metaphorical language. So are we going to call all metaphorical language make-believe? Is that how
I don't want to make that commitment.
I'm just trying to understand the term.
I know, but I preface what I'm about to say with I'm not intending to say anything big or grand about metaphors in general, but
The
that
views and
example
opinions of
is
Bill
from a
Bériault do
paper
not
called.
represent.
Sorry, but that paper is from an article called "Prop-Oriented or Metaphor and Prop-Oriented Make-Believe." So Walton does make use of the language of metaphor to help make sense of that example, and I think in some sense to try to account for how it is that metaphors can be true, or in what sense metaphors can be useful, I think would be a more accurate description. Because Walton ultimately, at the end of the day, would say that all the assertions he's dealing with are literally false. And so in a sense, I'm even pushing Walton a little bit further than what Walton would want to go with, right? Yeah.
I mean, I think the interesting, I think part of the issue with bringing Walton into this topic, because you're right, it is fascinating and it is applicable, but I think to some extent it's going to depend on how we understand what make-believe is, right? Because and I'm not going to try to challenge Walton here on this because it's not my area, but I'm not sure if I would call metaphorical language a fiction. I'm not even sure it's supposed to be a fiction. You know what I mean? Like if I say Italy is a boot.
Well, let me ask you this: is it an act of pretend?
So
when I say, for example, the city of Crotone is in the Arch of the Boot of Italy, do you really think it makes no sense to say that I'm in this instance pretending that Italy is a boot?
I don't think that in that case you're pretending Italy is a boot. I don't think that in the case of a metaphorical claim like that I can't claim to speak for everyone here, but I just don't think that in a case like that we would take that claim as meaning that Italy is an actual boot, so therefore the claim would be false.
Well, okay, well then let me ask you this. Would you accept that the truth of that assertion is dependent on a system that involves props, principles of generation, and that the truth of what we say is dependent on those props and principle of generation? And if that's if you don't like calling that make-believe, whatever, call it something else. I'll call it make-believe just because I think it's easy and simple, and I think it's intuitive and it makes sense to call it make-believe, and it's certainly how everyone else is talking about it. But
I don't. It's not that I don't necessarily have a position per se. It's just a question of, if we're not talking about something as being literally true, i.e., if we talk about the boot, Italy being a boot, are we therefore, because we're not saying something that's literally true, like Italy's not an actual boot, so therefore it's make believe. That's a jump that I'm just not sure about. It's not a question of me disagreeing that it's make believe or whether anyone else would take it as being make believe. It's just a question of, I think that if this idea of make believedly true assertions and their ability to sort of make sense of various domains, I do agree that that's a useful tool. It's a useful way of using Walton's work, but a lot of it's really going to depend on how and what we can call things to be make believe. So even if I accept, for example, that like numbers could be make believe, but I'm just not sure. I think I'm just trying to clarify what exactly gets to count as being make believe. So therefore, what can fit into that framework? You know what I mean?
So Walton himself would argue that something like everything like the representational arts, films, novels, illustrations, whatever, the way that we speak truly about them, or more in particular, when we try to say things are true about them, and when we speak about them as though they were true, then we are engaged in the make-believe, right? So it's not just necessarily, the example of city of Crotone is in the Arch of the Boot of Italy might be a bit dry, right? But if let's go back to one of the original examples we started with, Peter Parker is secretly Spider-Man, right? To say, well, that's true, right? Well, in that instance, I am participating in the make-believe, right? I am participating in the pretend that props and principles of generation are demanding me of. And so I think what might be your cause of concern here, right, is we need to look at when you speak about that assertion as being true, when you speak about it as being true that Italy is a boot, that's when you're participating in the make-believe. Does that help? Oh my God, I didn't take that back. That's a question I ask my students all the time, and I got it. I do that in the video lectures.
I mean, it does so insofar as it seems like, the question seems to be about if depending on what you're intending to represent. I mean, the thing is, if I say that Italy is, the city of Crotone is in the Arc of the Boot of Italy, I'm not necessarily saying. I don't think that in that case I'm actually saying Italy is a boot, and I don't think anyone would take me as saying that. But I wonder about certain things like metaphorical language, but I also wonder about other forms of representational content, right? Like, so for example, comparisons of the structure of atoms to the structure of the solar system.
We can see that his structure resembles, in many ways, something almost as vast as the atom is small. The solar system.
Right, we say an atom is kind of like the structure of a solar system. Really, it's not, but sometimes that's used as a sort of useful heuristic when teaching, physics to students. So, but in a case like that, are we saying something that's literally false, and should we understand that as being literally false, but it has this prop-oriented nature, or is it possibly just a different kind of thing altogether? Like, what if I have a model, for example, not like a physical model, and I say this is the solar system. It's not literally the solar system, but we take it as being representing the solar system. So therefore, should I interpret the model of the solar system as being a fiction, according to Walton, or is it something else?
If you are engaging with that model as props in order to say and discover and true things about the actual solar system, let's say, right? I think in that instance, you would be engaged in make-believing, right? That these, I don't know, let's call them painted styrofoam balls that, the ones we all did in junior high, right? Or probably elementary school, that's probably a better example. But, we are pretending, right? And, what if we do things like put a little Lego man on there and say this Lego man, this is Jim and Jim is on the moon, right? Yeah, we are pretending and we are engaging in make-believe. Other people may not like to think about it as such, but I don't know. It doesn't bother me so much to think that we can employ imagination and creativity in these really what might not seem to us in very obvious and probably surprising ways.
What about a case like a subway map, right? Where, you look at if you look at a subway map, it does not look like an actual map of a city, right? Or it doesn't look like like an actual map of much of anything other than the lines, right? Mm-hmm. So is that a kind of make-believe as well? I'm just trying to understand what forms of representation are make-believe, and what is there a difference between? Is there some middle ground between literal truth and make-believe? I think that's what
you said something that confused me there. Forms of make-believe, right? Like it's important to think of that this is an attempt to account for the usefulness of assertions we make that aren't true, right? It's not to say that there are other things out there that are say your question again, do you mind?
So I think what I'm just trying to get at is how expansive is the concept of make-believe? Is it anything that any assertion that we make isn't literally true as far as we can best understand it? Because obviously, I mean.
Well, I mean, like, I don't think there can be, like, let me ask you this, right? Do you think that there's any limit to what our imagination is, right? And to what creativity is? And it's kind of hard to put cages on that, right? And I think that, you know, I'm not going to try to make sense of necessarily every domain. I'm not trying to defend fictionalism everywhere. What I would say, though, is that the account of the usefulness of language that is not true that Walton's theory provides us with has helped to develop accounts of the usefulness of other domains of discourse, right? And now, how far, whether or not, let's say, a subway map is similarly a game of make-believe, I've never thought about it in any great length. It seems to me like if you're going to point and say, let's say you're riding with someone and they're asking, well, when's our stop? And you say it's 3 light bulbs away or something like that, right? Well, our stops are not literally light bulbs, and but nevertheless, thinking of our stops as light bulbs, even though it's not true that, you know, we're getting off at the 3rd light bulb, right? The usefulness of that assertion to help explain how we can use that assertion to know which stop to get off at, right, involves some pretending like, okay, the light bulbs I'm seeing on this subway map, I'm imagining a subway map where the stops light up. I don't know if that's obvious or not. But, you know, well, that 3rd light bulb, that's our stop, right? Well, that light bulb up there is not literally our stop, right? And if I point the light bulb and say, that's our stop, well, there's a sense in which we're going to say, well, no, it's not, you know, it's not actually our, like, if we wanted to be really technical about things, right? And God forgive philosophers,
it's kind of like the, yeah, well, it's kind of like the cops and robbers, right? This is a stop. It's just like saying there's $50 in the safe, right? Like it's a, yeah, okay.
It's just, you know, it's and so I think I want to stress again, right? This is a way to account for how we talk, right, and the usefulness of how we talk. At least that's what, you know, and I try to push that a bit further. But yeah, the usefulness of saying our stop is the 3rd light bulb, right? Well, that's explained by us pretending, just to grossly simplify things a little bit, right? That's explained by our pretending that the light bulbs are our stops, right? And when I say the 3rd light bulb is our stop, well, that's not literally true. Nevertheless, it's still useful for us to know which stop I'm supposed to get off at, right? And so make-believe provides this account, right? It allows us to make sense of discourse that is not true, but may nevertheless still be useful.
So it seems like the things that you're really latching onto are you know, the framework. It's not necessarily as important to talk about make-believe and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously that stuff matters, but it's more about what you get out of the framework, the ability to talk about things that are a representation of things that aren't literally true, but we can still talk about the truth within the framework, right?
Yeah, right. Like,
but with all these additional, like the prop-oriented.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, the idea here. So, like, when we talked earlier about our ghosts, our friends who doesn't, you know, oh, I just don't believe in ghosts. Well, if ghosts manage to get us onto the moon, well, it seems like at that point I'm owed an explanation, or no, sorry, I'm an explanation is due from me, right? Or
you seek one.
Yeah, right. Like, well, how, you know? And if I'm somebody who's just like, no, I refuse. Ghosts do not exist, right? So there must be some other explanation, right? Well, now it's on me to try to provide that account of how it is that despite the fact that everything we say about ghosts aren't true, we could still get to the moon with them. Well, this is precisely the dilemma that the mathematical fictionalist is, or no, I shouldn't say the mathematical fictionalist, but specifically, but any anti-realist who's trying to discuss the non-existence of something that nevertheless proves useful in discourse for us. Right? And fictionalism and make-believe is one way to think about that. Well, why are these things useful? Well, because it's an act of pretend, right? The ghosts aren't really there. The ghosts are something we're pretending are there, and they're explainable by something else, right? Or at least we could hopefully provide some alternative account where we don't have to actually really be committed to the existence of ghosts. But the ghost just happens to make things easier for us to talk about it, right? And so this was exactly the project that Hartree Field, probably considered one of the first mathematical fictionalists, really tried to, or at least in contemporary mathematics, contemporary philosophy of mathematics, really tried to do. He tried to prove that mathematics as we know it is nothing more than what's usually called a conservative extension of nominalistic language. Now that's a whole lot of jargon, but basically what that means is mathematics is an easy way for us to talk about something, but whatever we could talk about with mathematics, we could say in other ways that didn't involve language that referred to other things, to actual mind-independent things. It would be way more complicated, but we could still do it, right? And so he wrote a pretty infamous book now called Science Without Numbers, where he tried to outline and demonstrate Newton's law of gravity in entirely nominalistic language. Whether or not that suffices to show that all mathematics can be done like that, and whether or not he was even indeed successful, are all things we can debate. But the idea is there, though, right? The intuition that, mathematics, this appeal to abstract entities, to things that, that many find ridiculous to believe would actually exist, right? Like, all of it is just an act of pretend. And it's an act of pretend that's really useful for us, and it helps us in a great deal of ways. But we could have just as easily maybe potentially had an entirely different act of pretend, or a different nature of pretend, or we could just as easily have maybe potentially far more complex ways of talking about things that didn't involve pretend. But nevertheless, pretend is useful.
Sure.
And I should also note really quickly here, sorry, that Hartree Field tried to show that mathematics was quote-unquote dispensable by showing that it was nothing more than a conservative extension over nominalistic language. And that was a strategy that he took. But not every mathematical anti-realist actually takes this approach. Mary Lang, for instance, rather than try to argue against something like the indispensability of mathematics, rather she tries to argue against something like Quine's conformational holism, which is a whole other can of worms. And maybe we can get there. But it is an inspiration. Yeah.
I find it kind of interesting because you referenced pretending quite a bit, and the question, and of course I know I don't want to push. I'm not assuming anything behind that word pretend, right? But I do want to ask you this: if the idea here is that when we are engaging in math, we are engaging in an act of pretend, at least on some level.
Yeah.
So the question, therefore, is that an empirical claim, right? So if I were to check the brains, if I were to use an fMRI on a child playing cops and robbers, and if I was to use an fMRI on a mathematician doing a proof, would I expect to find a similar kind of, obviously they wouldn't be the same, a similar kind of brain state such that there would be evidence that the mathematician is engaging in pretend or imagination?
I've only thought about trying to find empirical basis for this a little bit, but the one thought that I had was that if any type of study were to be done like that, I think it would have to be done while the child is learning mathematics and not say, let's say, after it has already happened, right? I think that would, if there is any potential to empirically prove that, fine. But in the same sense, I can turn this empirical question around and ask, give me empirical evidence of these abstract objects you seem to be referring to, right? And then the question is, well, which is the more empirically tenable, or not necessarily, but which is the least offensive commitment, right? That, these abstract objects can have causal connections with our minds, and that we do indeed perceive them in some significant sense, or that really we're just pretending. Yeah. So this empirical question is an interesting one, but it's a question for math in general. It's not simply, and it's going to be a question for any account of math, and not just a fictionalist's.
Do you take this as being an empirical question though? Do you, like, for example, if you could look at this two ways, right? You could say something like, math, when we look at the evidence for people who do math, and when we look at the historical evidence, we don't really find any evidence of pretend or fictional thinking, right? Like, that's just not what the brain is doing. Now, of course, this is a very general question. I wouldn't be surprised if an fMRI were to show that, because math is a creative process anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if there were no empirical evidence, or if the empirical evidence showed that we don't engage in pretend, which obviously we don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah,
yeah. But would that be a problem, or would you, or is the assertion, well, math or logically this is what we're doing anyways?
So, I would have to learn more about whether or not fMRIs that identify make-believe, that sounds like a pretty big can of worms there. But like, let's just, for the sake of it, run with the assumption that we have some way of describing that, right? I think in one sense I would just say,
and I want to clarify that this would be incredibly tricky.
Yeah, right. I would just say, when we look at whatever neural mapping we get when we look at people engaging in mathematics, I can just say, well, that's a game of make-believe they're playing, right? And that's how that game of make-believe looks like when it transpires in our brain. Now, if an fMRI were to show me that there was indeed some causal connection between an abstract object, well, then I'd be a little suspicious of the machinery, but that would be, to me, far more damning, right? To prove that there was some sensory perception that we were having of abstract entities. And in terms of the history of mathematics and thinking through mathematics, right? It's important to note that the question of realism is an old one in mathematics, right? It's been around a really, really long time. Plato's realist about mathematics, right? It's all over, right? In many different philosophical traditions. And I think, fast forward, a few thousand years, because I'm a more contemporary guy than a history guy. But, and we get, even before accounts of fictionalism, we get competing accounts of what it means for a mathematical assertion to be true, precisely because lots of people don't want to say that there are these abstract objects that exist, right? And so we get like a combinatorial or a formalist approach, where mathematical truth, is the product of proof production. But it's not, if we don't possess some proof of the truth or falsity of the assertion in question, well, then it is neither true nor false, right? Now, a realist would not make such a commitment. Even if we don't have a proof of it, the assertion, insofar as it's accurately representing something or not, will be true or false, right? And so I think this is really a significant aspect of metaphysics, I think, and it's kind of relevancy to a lot of fields, right? Is that our commitments about the realism or not will have a big role in whether or not we accept the principle of bivalence, and the principle of bivalence being that all assertions are definitively true or false, right? Now, this is something that Dummett, famously proposed as a way of trying to understand realist positions as a commitment to the principle of bivalence, and to understand anti-realist commitments as being the sorts of commitments that would undercut the justification for such a commitment. That would undercut a commitment to the principle of bivalence, or that would at least cast doubt on it, right? Because now we're not talking about something that is out there, right? So an example is Goldbach's conjecture true? Well, no proof of it exists, right? So if you're a mathematical anti-realist or some kind of constructivist or a combinatorial or formalist or whatever, right, you're going to say, well, until we have a proof that Goldbach's conjecture is true, it is neither true nor false. But the realist is going to say, well, no, it's either true or false. And it's true or false because it's referring to something that's out there.
Yeah, and even if we never find out, it has a truth value that is either one or the other. It's a 1 or a 0, right?
Right. And this is a debate that's, that's been going on for quite a while in mathematics, I think, right? And so, when we ask ourselves about how we use fMRIs to talk about understanding mathematics, right? Like, what kind of considerations would go in there, right? Again, it seems like it would have to be, well, is there some reason to believe that there's some empirical thing that we're interacting with, right? And insofar as we, let's say, continue to fail to find any kind of empirical evidence for such a thing, it seems natural to assume, I think, anyways, right, that something else is going on there besides a realist account of mathematics, right?
So I mean, to the realist, the mathematical truths would almost be they would be the kinds of things you'd find out in the world, right? I keep thinking of Hume's talking about looking for ethical facts, right? He looks at the crime scene, he looks at all of the details of the crime, but he can't see the fact that it's wrong. He can't find it. Right.
So, like, and for the problem with morality, for instance, right, or not the problem, but the dilemma, at least for morality, is, we can have all the descriptive facts in the world, right? None of that description, however, none of our, empirical statements that we could make that would help us describe the situation, none of that reveals the sort of normative, let's call them entities for the time being, that moral discourse seems to appeal to, right? Which is to say, the features that give us some sort of oughtness, right? Rather than simply saying what is the case.
Johnny was murdered. There was a knife used, right? But where is the fact? Where is the fact that this was wrong, right? Can't find that. In the same way that we can find, 5 marbles on the table, but we don't see the number 5, right? Like,
precisely, right? Like that, so this is precisely the route that Mary Lang takes or this is what precisely motivates her mathematical fictionalism, right? So she takes herself to be responding to Quine's very influential argument for mathematical realism, and also Putnam's as well, that because mathematics is indispensable to our best and most successful scientific theories, we're warranted in making a commitment to their existence, right? And so, simply put, because they're indispensable, we should just believe that they're out there, right? Like I mentioned, Hartree Field was in a lot of ways an attempt to try to show, well, no, actually mathematics is dispensable. We can say it differently. It helps us, but we can say it differently. Mary Lang, however, like I mentioned, she tries to argue that, well, just because a scientific experiment or theory, whatever, is successful, and the evidence we have from its success does not carry equally over every commitment of that theory. And so some of the examples she gives is, our ability to measure trajectories of missiles, for instance, would not give us reasons to believe in, let's say, something like perfect vacuums, or, the success of theories that make use of frictionless planes does not give us reason to believe that the evidence, or that we now have evidence of the existence of frictionless planes. And so she takes her argument and her mathematical fictionalism as a way to try to provide an account of mathematics as an idealization akin to things like frictionless planes, perfect vacuums, continuous substances when we're measuring the nature of fluids, right? Just because we have success in understanding the nature of fluids, when we make use of the assumption, let's say, that they're a continuous substance, right? Well, we don't take that as evidence that they are indeed continuous substances. And so, yeah, that's what Mary Lang's project is about.
Okay, so picking back up on the idea of pretend, and pretending in these kinds of make-believedly true claims. The thing I think I want to ask when it comes to mathematics is do we need to be aware of the fact that we are engaging in these make-believedly true assertions? In other words, if I'm a mathematician, do I need to know that I'm engaging in some act of make-believe, or does it matter?
I don't think it does. I don't think it does matter. I think the sort of explanation that mathematical fictionalism offers is the sort of explanation that, a neuroscientist could offer us about, like, what goes into me reaching for something, right? That has, that offers us greater understanding and appreciation of what is happening, but that doesn't help me, or that was never information that I needed in order to, let's say, reach out and pick up a can of beer, right? That was never any information I needed to successfully be able to use my arms. And so I think no, right? Like, this is not the sort of explanation that is trying to say, like, this is how mathematicians think about it, right? It's saying, like, no, this is what's going on in the background here, and offering that sort of explanation.
So in response to the concern about error theory, and maybe it might help to just sort of explain sort of step by step what's going on. So for the error theorist in general, they're going to say that if you talk about something, or if you try to assert something about something that doesn't exist, but you think it does, there's a sort of systematic error that's taking place, right?
Right.
So
I like to think of it in terms of, if you're sincerely believing that you're uttering a true assertion, you are in error.
So if I'm a mathematician, and mathematics is a kind of fiction, and I don't know that or if I don't think that I'm saying something that's fictional, if I'm not aware that I'm part of the mathematical game, the language game, or whatever, however you want to describe it, but I'm still doing math, am I deluded? And if so, am I still making an error?
Well, what I would say, this all depends on the particular person, right? Different mathematicians might have are going to have different. I mean, at least every time I've bothered to ask and discuss and try to explore these issues with mathematicians, when they'll tolerate me, they have various levels of commitment about this, and those commitments could shift, right? Like, this is not necessarily something that they've thought about when they've been learning and practicing mathematics, right? Like I've been saying, this is not something that's necessary to practice mathematics, I think, right? Or it's not knowledge that facilitates practice of mathematics necessarily. And so, the error theorist is going to want to say that, like, look, anybody at all who thinks that a mathematical assertion is true is in error. And part of my project, in large part, is motivated by thinking that is just, wildly immodest, right? Like, and I don't have much of a backing for it, but I think it's not necessarily an uncommon intuition that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is a true assertion. And not only is it a true assertion, but holy smokes, if there were ever such thing as a paradigmatically true assertion, it's 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, right? And so I think that that's a real problem with a lot of mathematical fictionalists. And, in particular, I think it's a problem with the mathematical fictionalism of Mary Lang and Stephen Yablo, who both seem to accept and develop this error theory approach to understanding mathematical discourse. And what baffles me all the more on it is it seems to me that all the work that they've done in developing their fictionalists' accounts to provide an account of the usefulness of this discourse, to me just seems to be like, well, this is the semantics of the discourse. What does it mean for a mathematical assertion to be true? Well, a mathematical assertion is true if it's warranted in the mathematical game of make-believe at play, right? That's what mathematical truth is. And with that simple shift, I think we're given the ability to say, look, mathematical assertions are true. We're not referring to any abstract entities out there because the semantics in question for mathematical assertions aren't representational. The semantics are informed by this make-believe game. And so this notion, and I think this worry that you're trying to allude to of trying to point to mathematicians and say, nope, that's not true, right? Like, I agree. That's I don't think that that's a reasonable, or I think let's put it this way. Anti-realism in many regards is inspired by what David Lewis would call an incredulous stare, right? The incredulous stare we give to explanations that seem to involve just the existence of wild entities that we would find outlandish, right? And just insist that there must be a better explanation. Well, I think if anti-realists are, and I think most anti-realists are ultimately kind of motivated by some kind of sympathy to an intuition such as that, right? Well, I think if we're going to take that seriously, we saying that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is false is, I think, just as worthy as an incredulous stare as Platonism is. And so, in large part, my project was to try to take what I thought were already really great developments of fictionalism and say, look, rather than be error theorists about this, right, which is to say, rather than accept that our assertions are representational, but they fail to be successful, so they're false, right? Why not instead say the assertions are not representational, they are informed by this make-believe, and that allows us to say that they are true. And we still allow to, I think, preserve many of the anti-realist intuitions that motivate a fictionalist position in the first place. But with this simple, what I consider really just a little nudge of the position. Well, I think it's a bigger nudge for Lang than it is for Yablo. But, and then Lang, the bit of contact I had with Lang, she told me that her commitment to error theory was motivated by a commitment to representational semantics. And in particular that there was only one kind of semantics and only one kind of truth, and it was that which was informed by representational semantics. So it's, it's a greater nudge in Mary Lang's case. But regardless, I think she provides all of the tools necessary for that shift. And so I think it just seems to me like this really intuitive move to make. And then so that was what motivated my project. And I was exploring, well, how do I make sense of this move? What are some potential, I do also explore modal fictionalism as also as mathematical fictionalism in my dissertation, as well as some of the more controversial underlying theoretical commitments, such as that towards alethic pluralism and logical pluralism more generally.
You mentioned something just recently I find kind of interesting. You mentioned mathematicians and what they might think of your work. I asked this in the context of somebody who is also interested in philosophy of science. Do you do you think that there's a great response from mathematicians? Do you think mathematicians should be taking what the philosophers have to say more seriously, or what are your thoughts on that in terms of academic colleagueship?
I think insofar as let's I'm debating about how schlocky and sentimental I want to get about this.
Schlock away.
Yeah, in terms of if we're going to think about trying to like cultivate and develop a wisdom about a topic, and develop kind of a really sophisticated appreciation for what a particular practice is, and its role for humans, right? And its place to human life and human endeavors, and it's just the kind of bigger picture of it all, right? I think it can be very illuminating. What I find particularly interesting right now, and what I'm hoping is some actual relevancy, is with regards to whether or not, let's say, something like a fictionalist position could outline an alternative to structuralist approaches. A lot of really interesting work right now is being done in on-text structural realism in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of mathematics. And it seems like a lot of people seem to think that this might have some interesting ramifications for how we try to think through and develop quantum theory and quantum mechanics, right? And so, especially when we're trying to think through, well, how do we make sense of relations without relata, right? How do we abstract away so that we only look at the structure of relationships rather than the actual things that are being related to? And so I think that that's one really interesting route right now. And I happen to know that, at least at the University of Waterloo with the Perimeter Institute, that there's really interesting stuff going on right now. Discussion with philosophy of physics right now. A guy named Thomas Galley is working over there right now on that topic. He's a postdoc researcher at the Perimeter Institute. And he's been researching on-text structural realism. So, like, I think, I would say, don't dismiss its, although at first it might just seem like, look, we're maybe cultivating this bigger picture appreciation of something that maybe doesn't necessarily have, let's say, like, boots on the ground impact, right? Well, I would say that, that appreciation is still worthwhile, especially if we're trying to understand math and its place in human life and human endeavor and then in the world around us. But also that, it has a lot of really interesting developments in and potential implications for actual research, right? The whole difference between classical mathematics and intuitionistic mathematics, at least I would kind of agree with Dummett on this, I think, right? That, that's largely motivated by metaphysical commitments, right? With classical mathematics being committed to realism, and intuitionistic mathematics, which would be akin to the or it's the sort of same sort of mathematics that we were talking about earlier with the combinatorialism and the formalism, where mathematical truth is determined by proof production, right? Well, that's motivated by anti-realism, and that metaphysical commitment has had a real impact in the development of these two really distinct mathematical systems. And there are some people who might still insist that only one of them is the correct mathematics. And the basis upon which they would argue which is the correct mathematics is usually motivated by a person's metaphysical commitments. Now, as an aside, I think my approach allows us to embrace mathematical pluralism, and that's usually a strength of fictionalist approaches to mathematics in general, right? Is that they allow for an accommodation of mathematical pluralism. And that's easy because we're looking at the various practices of mathematics as their own kind of make-believe games.
I mean, it sounds like even to, for example, the average person who, I mean, it strikes me that this could be relevant to, like, even I guess you could call it scientific literacy in the sense that if we fold math into science, but it's part of that, right? Where people, your average person who isn't trained in these kinds of things may struggle to understand how things can be true sometimes. I mean, you see this nowadays
Well,
with
how many of us
COVID.
learned to tie our shoes by imagining a rabbit was going down the rabbit hole, right? Yeah, is that the sort of kind of thing you're thinking about here?
Well, it's not just that. I'm thinking about to the average person who might encounter a scientific or mathematical claim in a way that might be highly abstract, right? The idea that being able to articulate exactly how these things can be true and what we mean when we say that those things are true, I think is always going to be important to allowing society as a whole to sort of better understand topics that come up in normal life.
Right. And I think more generally that cultivating, I don't want to sound super snobbish and call it like a literacy on philosophy of science, but at least cultivating some appreciation and reflection on these issues could at least help us respond to the skeptical worries, that we might see so prevalent in a lot of contemporary discourse, right? At least, if someone were to say, well, I mean, I don't think anybody would really ever challenge, like, the sorts of people we might worry about would never really challenge, let's say 2 + 2 is equal to 4 or something like that. But they might challenge why it is that mathematics shows the truth that the world is not flat, right? And being able to offer some explanation of how, or at least some inkling, right, of how it is that this reference to all of these abstract entities, right, or seemingly reference to abstract entities. Like I said, I don't really think that's the right way to think of it, but that's, that could really help us respond to some skeptical worries, right? And how he's like having some awareness of philosophy of science, for instance, puts us in a better position to respond to, say, something like the pessimistic meta-induction, or where well, science was wrong before, so who's to say it's not wrong now? I like to think of, I don't know if you ever watched the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but there's this great scene where a character named Mac is going over the scientists, and he's basically explaining the pessimistic meta-induction, where he's like, oh, Aristotle was like this. Everyone thought he was really smart. But you know what? He also thought this, and it was completely wrong. He was... I'm not, I know you're trying to keep a PC, family-friendly show. But, needless to say, he goes, and Galileo, right? He goes through other scientists, and he goes, look, all of these people had these things that they believed at the time that were wrong. Like a scientific theory that was really useful, let's say 1,000 years ago, right? Aristotelian gravitational probably helped to make some predictions, right? It wasn't entirely, or that the planets were affixed to crystalline spheres in the sky, right? I'm forgetting the precise name of it, but I'm thinking of those globes that they used to use to measure the movement of the planets, where it's like the planet in the middle, but then they have these various spheres around it, and they believed, right, the planets were affixed to these crystalline spheres, right? Well, that offered some effectiveness. Needless to say, we would probably now say that, well, that's completely bonkers, right? Like, there are no crystalline spheres affixed in space that are upon which these various celestial bodies are hanging from, right? If someone were to tell us now, well, everything now could just as easily be wrong, and 1,000 years from now we could think something entirely different. Well, at least having some preparation to be able to respond to worries like that, right? Because they're not necessarily, wrong-headed worries, right?
No, well, I mean,
they can be employed in some weird ways, but
I mean, the thing is, I mean, you don't have to look too far. I mean, even with COVID and the populace is essentially being given the results or the findings of various sort of models that sort of project where they think will go, where things will they think will go, and there's a sort of frustration and confusion when there's revisions along the way where they say, well, no, it's actually more like this, and I think part of the issue is there's this larger social relationship to how, broadly speaking, we understand the notion of truth and what it means for things to be true. So being able to say, well, in this context, here's what we mean by true, and here's how that works, I think is extraordinarily valuable. Not just by itself, but because it begins the conversation, as you were talking about earlier, of talking about the fact that there are different ways to talk about truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's not merely bivalence, or it doesn't have to only be bivalence, and there are different ways of talking about truth in different
Well, there are people who are going to
circumstances.
disagree with us, even though you and I might see the light. But, yeah, I think, like, look, like, so for example, right, like, even if, you want to be committed to, let's say, the sort of fictionalism that says, like, look, no, these are not actually true, right? At least being able to explain how they're still useful helps, right? And being prepared to offer some response, I think, is, it's of incredible use to help us think through how it is that we navigate the world, right? And I think you put it really well, right? Like thinking through how things are true and being able to offer some response when we're faced with a skeptical worry, right? Well, like, hang on here, I don't think what we're saying here is true. Right? Well, maybe the issue here is how we're thinking about what truth is, right? It does, just because what makes I am holding a beer can right now true or false work for objects like beer cans, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that every domain of discourse that we engage in has to be that way, I think, right? Now, granted, it is an incredibly intuitive way to think through truth, right? And typically when we try to argue that things are not true, right, we do kind of appeal to the fact that, well, there's nothing there, right? But usually that might be in the case
No
of something...
ghosts.
Yeah, but usually that'll be in the case of something like the medium-sized objects that we actually have empirical relationship with, right? Like, hang on a second, I'm not dealing with it. I don't see any ghosts. I played with my Ouija board a whole bunch of times. Nothing's happened, right? So ghosts don't exist, right? And so talk about ghosts, I'm going to say, yeah, ghosts don't exist, and so any assertion about them are false.
Would you say that you ain't afraid of no ghosts?
I ain't no afraid of no ghosts, no. Although I will, I do love horror movies, all right. And one of my favorites lately, well, not lately, but like I was a big fan of the Paranormal Activity movie. I thought that was a pretty good one.
I like the first one.
Yeah, the first one.
So I want to ask you about this in terms of the applicability of some of the stuff outside of math, because I find it kind of interesting because for one thing, these topics and issues, as we've already kind of talked about, are relevant to science and the philosophy of science, and they're relevant to ethics. They're kind of relevant to any kind of thing where we kind of think something might exist, but we don't. It's hard to sort of empirically show where it is.
Yep.
So has your own work on mathematical fictionalism, has it led you to revise your views on for example, ethics? And have you thought about how you might stand? I know you're not necessarily a philosopher of science, but have you thought about how this might affect your own answer to a question like, do electrons exist?
Well, with regards to ethics, one thing that's, for me, at least my experiences, as particularly as I've been reading on mathematical and modal fictionalism, that's where much of my work got directed after I kind of stumbled onto my research project. I became really rather unimpressed with moral fictionalists' accounts. It's been a long time since I've really bothered to go into it any depth, but it always seems to me in terms of like so first and foremost, oh man, it's been so long since I've read Mark like Calderon or Joyce, but and I'm trying to remember if any of them actually make any explicit Waltonian appeal or not. But what I do know is that a lot of mathematical fictionalists will sometimes point to something like usefulness for evolutionary success, right? So the way to think about morality is, look, these normative features in the universe, they don't exist, right? All that exists about the universe, and the only thing that's true about the universe is what's descriptive of it. And so the idea is, well, then why do we have moral discourse? And let's run with an assumption here. It's been useful for us, right? How do we explain now moral discourse, right? And its usefulness to us and its place for us. And so a lot of fictionalists have pointed to, well, it's useful in terms of providing evolutionary success. And then we can define what is morally true or false in terms of, what has allowed us to cultivate evolutionary success. To me, this doesn't answer the question. The question there, right? There's still the open argument question, right? Like, why are we defining this in terms of evolutionary success? It seems to me that when we're talking about morality, we could still ask ourselves, well, why ought it be, the evolutionary success? Now, if all we're trying to offer is a descriptive account, then okay, whatever. But then fictionalism kind of loses some of its interesting allure, I think, in that case. Because then it's no longer just explaining, look, this is a make-believe idea, or that's all it's explaining, right? It's not also explaining the usefulness of the discourse at that point, or necessarily, right? And so, how we understand usefulness of moral discourse, to me, it's an interesting question. How do we think about what is morality useful for? Is there something that it ought to be useful for? And are we permitted to just assume that what we should think about here is evolutionary success?
I mean, I don't know if you need only evolutionary success for this. I mean, it's kind of interesting because
so this is I just want to reiterate, this is a very big simplification on my part, and it's been a while since I've actually really looked at mathematical fictionalism.
Sure,
or like actual mathematical fictionalist positions. But if we were trying to think of one that adhered to a Waltonian approach of thinking about fictions.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about this in terms of, I mean, first of all, like with the open question argument, right? Like you could apply the same reasoning to the cops and robbers example, right? You can always say, well, should we call this bag of money the loot? Should we call the bag a safe? Should we call the car or the box a car, right? But in this case, we can say, well, it's not just a matter of evolutionary success or advantage. I mean, even just on a social level, if you want to say something like, just as we might say, like the bag of Monopoly money is $50, we can say something like, wearing a mask is a moral good, right? Now, the moral good part would be the fictional part. The wearing the mask part would be the prop, right? And the good is in the proof of the pudding, that if you wear a mask, less people get sick, and therefore, it's less socially harmful and detrimental and destabilizing, and that's part of our successful game of ethics, I guess. Is that not plausible, or is there something else?
I'm not denying that's not plausible, right? Like, I mean, me, I'm a sappy kind of person. I'd rather just root it and care for other people, but that's just it, right? Like, why would I be wrong in that instant, right? And maybe what you're saying could just be rephrased in terms of care for other people. But what about the times when it doesn't, right? What about the times when, let's say, some sort of moral imperative, and let's assume fictionalism, right? Like, and let's assume,
sure.
Up to this point, I've been working with, what is effective for fostering greater care amongst people, and you've been working with, I don't know, evolutionary success or whatever, right? Or some other combination of some other things that doesn't include what I'm thinking, right? And
I mean, it doesn't have to be an either or.
Yeah, but like,
if it's a fictional game we're playing, then there can be lots of uses, presumably, right?
Well, but here's the thing about this, right? So again, I'm somebody who thinks that the metaphysical commitments we make has a big deal on whether or not we accept the principle of bivalence for the semantics in a given discourse. And this has a big role in how we determine what rules of inference are correct or not. So if in a given make-believe game, let's say in yours, you've accepted the principle of bivalence, and let's say you've accepted it as a principle of generation, right? Whereas in mine, I have not. Okay. Well, now the sorts of inferences that we can make in our respective domains of discourse and our respective make-believes is very different. For instance, in your game of make-believe, with the principle of bivalence, you would be allowed to make, let's say, a double negation elimination, right? Which is to say you'd be able to equate not P with P. Under a logical framework or a logical system, intuitionistic one, that doesn't accept the principle of bivalence, such an inference is not actually valid, because P does not have to necessarily be true or false, right? And so this is a really big issue, I think, right? And so when I say a fictionalist can accommodate mathematical pluralism, when I said that earlier, right, what I meant to say is that, a fictionalist doesn't necessarily have to make the decision whether or not a given, a make-believe that they make has to be dedicated to the principle of bivalence or not, right? But if it's a realist domain, well, then, yeah, we're going to have the principle of bivalence. If you're a strictly constructivist, you're going to say, no, there's never any principle of bivalence that's ever warranted. And I think that and all of this leads to this great dilemma of, well, which logical system, which rules, which sets of inference will be correct for a given domain of discourse, right? And there's a whole other worry when we start mixing domains of discourses, right? When we have an argument that, let's say, mixes an anti-realist domain with a realist domain. So, like, a really good example of this is one by Christine Tapolet. And so she gives us the example of an argument, wet cats are funny, this cat is wet, so this cat is funny. Right? Now let's say, plausibly, that we're realists about wet cats. Right? We're realists about cats in general. But suppose we're anti-realists about humor, and about what constitutes being funny or not, and what truth in humor means. Well, if we ask ourselves now, in this argument that seems to be mixing these two different notions of truth, well, which notion of truth is the conclusion inheriting? How do we account for the validity of this argument now, if we've accepted that there are different kinds of truth? And also, if we've accepted that different kinds of truth will lead to different commitments regarding what sorts of rules of inference are correct. Right? And so, when we think about morality, right, and honestly, this is, a kind of reflection that's spawning on me now, right? In terms of trying to think of, well, everybody can have their moral make-believe, right? Well, that's not going to really help us solve a whole lot of problems when, let's say, different make-believes, clash, right? Or when clash is such an adversarial way of putting it, but when different people have to get together to solve the same problem, right? And even though this might muddy the situation a little bit, at least being aware that the sorts of commitments we make regarding the reality of things and regarding the truth of things that we make has an impact about how we reason about these things. And it will have an impact about how we reason about these things with others.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you on that. Yeah. It strikes me that I'm a pragmatist. So for me, I'm always trying to clarify the concepts and the parameters on which we're having the discussion. So it's always like, what do you mean by this, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, if we aren't clear about the kind of framework that we're using, or the game we're playing, or however you want to phrase that, you're gonna run into lots of problems. But I mean, again, within the framework of talking about ethics, I mean, the ability to use the tool of a fictionalism, where we can talk about how things can be true within a discourse, and the kinds of rules that we're using, and why we're using these rules, and how this framework works. If we can have those kinds of conversations, then we may be possibly less inclined to have those kinds of moral confrontations, because we might say, well, we're using different frameworks, and so we have to either come up with a new framework that we can both understand and work with, or agree to one framework or the other, in order to be able to discuss truth, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my big hesitation with moral fictionalism and embracing moral fictionalism, I guess, is that, morality itself is just, everybody has usually some very passionate and, very strong moral commitments in some regard, on some thing or another. And I think that makes it more difficult, I think, to try to argue that, how do I want to say this? I think it's harder to put together a compelling fictionalist argument in an instance like that than it would be in, let's say, even in philosophy of mathematics, right? And then, granted, it's a hard sell in philosophy of mathematics, right? And, and granted, there are people out there with very passionate and strong beliefs about what the nature of mathematical truth is. But I think there's something more... I have nothing but intuitions on this matter, so it's hard for me to... I've been stuck so far in analytical metaphysics that... but, it's just... It's much more difficult to make the pitch that, look, these are the props that we're dealing with here, right? And these are the props for everybody, right?
Sure.
Than it would be for mathematics, right? Because, like I mentioned, I would find something like the open argument there some compelling, right? Like, well, why those ones? Why not these ones? And even though it might seem like, well, it doesn't matter, right? Or that we could still have compatible, right? Or that they might be coincidentally or accidentally compatible. And let's say for a really long time they are, up until they're not, right? And then what's truth? I don't know. I'm rambling at this point because, well, I'll simplify things a little bit. I often like to call myself a reluctant error theorist, right?
Well, I think this is why I find this question so interesting, because you've often expressed your feelings on error theory, and now I'm wondering if you've revised your thoughts a little bit.
Well, so the thing is I'm not yet convinced. So I was hoping, right, that a look into fictionalism would help me, in some sense, overcome the sort of error theory that I couldn't help but be committed to in morality, right? I mean, you know me, I'm somebody who's got some pretty impassioned moral and political commitments. And like I mentioned, when I first started my PhD, my intention was to try to find a metaethical backing for these commitments, because I do find these questions important, right? I don't think we should ever stop our pursuits of justice just because we don't necessarily know the answer yet. But I do think that they are important questions, and we shouldn't just brush them aside. In large part, like I said, our commitments might determine what is correct inference or not.
I keep thinking of the cops and robbers example. If I was, essentially coming up with a framework for a fictional framework, but one where I could come up with truth values within it, right? I'm also kind of thinking of Carnap and his idea of internal and external frameworks. And so, like, for him, if at the framework level, when you ask questions about, like, what kind of framework you want, it's just a practical question at that point. You just decide that that's what you want. So
logic has no morals, right? That's Carnap, right? I'm not freaking out there.
It's close enough for Carnap, I suppose.
No, come on. We want to be taken seriously, right?
But well, I mean, I don't really take Carnap's views on ethics that seriously. So I think that's the problem.
Carnap does.
There's a guy who talked about ethics and never really looked at it. But in his case, for him, you don't really have that problem of saying, well, should we do it this way? Because his answer would just be, well, you just are. Like, that's the game you're playing, right? So I mean, I think I take your worry being that how do we know, like, how can we possibly even agree to a framework, or how can we even know we're talking about the same framework? Is that closer to what your worry is? As opposed to the justification of, well, I'm going to call murder wrong, and it's not because there's some sort of external justification I'm looking for. It's just that's the rule of the game I'm playing, just as I would say that this bag of Monopoly money is $50 or it's 100,000, or however much a bank would have.
I think my concern is that the argument that's going to be needed, right, to try to offer a compelling argument for, like, look, these are the props that are in play. These are the principles of generation that are in play, right? At the very least, if you're trying to, let's say, offer some uniform account of all human morality and try to say, we can use mathematical fictionalism to account for a morality that is applicable to all human beings and useful to all of them, right? Like, and I think, it sounds, worded that way, it sounds a little hard, but that's what a lot of people think morality is in the game about, right? Morality is the right way for human beings to behave, right? And my concern is that fictionalism can offer a pluralism. That's easy for fictionalism to do, right? The question is whether or not there's one, right? And whether or not we could use fictionalism as a way to sort of account for this, all-encompassing global approach to moral discourse, right? And, that seems to me like a very great task. I'm not saying I'm not interested in it. I am ultimately still interested in it, even though it's not. I'm finished my dissertation and I'm not even looking at that research area just yet. But yeah,
sure. It sounds like a
really
great
interesting
avenue
too to think about. Like, I think when it comes to fictionalism and human behavior or human activity, I think it would also really be interesting to look at politics, right? What is the nature of political obligation, and the various political obligations that, let's say, end up producing a government, right?
You might even be able to find out if a politician's capable of even telling the truth.
Yeah. Very true.
It's all within their fiction, right? I want to ask you about science a little bit too. So I'm curious, where do you stand on, for example, the existence of unobservable scientific entities? Are they a kind of fiction, do you think, or are you willing to be more of a realist there, or do you not have a position?
Well, I think I might have put my cards on the table there earlier with the analogy to ghosts. With my insistence on the incredulous stare to Platonism in various instances towards abstract entities, I in general, I find the notion that abstract entities exist to be suspicious. At the very least, what exists are, the stuff that I can interact with, right? And so when it comes to things like, let's say, electrons, right? And granted, I'm not, I haven't done the hard physics of it, right?
Sure.
But from my understanding, all we really have are some evidences of uniform observations that, if we assume that there was one thing causing all of it, would be very convenient for us. And so we do, and we call it an electron. I would think that, at least in this instance, right? And so similar to your question about fMRIs earlier, right? But until you prove to me realism is the case, right? I'm inclined to think anti-realist, right? Especially if you're talking to me about unobservable or abstract entities, right? I'm inclined to think, it's better to hold our horses, and at least not reason with the assumption that it is with a realist commitment until, or maybe not, I don't know.
I mean, it's interesting because are you familiar with Nancy Cartwright?
Yeah, of course. Well, it's been a while, but I know she's the neurophysicist, philosopher type, right? Neuroscientist, philosopher type, cognitive scientist.
Yeah, well, yeah, she was sort of famously wrote the book How the Laws of Physics Lie, right?
Okay.
And she gives this account. She says, for example, that most of the actual, like, what we call physical laws, strictly speaking, are false. They are literally false because in order to be true, it would require essentially an infinite number of
Conditional
qual
statements.
yeah, qualifying clauses that would make it
Yeah.
applicable to the actual
And
situation.
conditional statements are not usually, we think of as strictly being as the sorts of things that are in themselves. And well, but like, yeah, but
Yeah,
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 that's a big problem, right? Like, if we're dealing with a domain of discourse that is not providing us with true assertions, well, then how do we make sense of its usefulness? And so, like, Winger has this great paper on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the physical sciences, right? And it's all about how all of these mathematical practices that seem developed for one purpose and for one task end up being incredibly useful for this other entirely unrelated task in physics. Well, how is that, right? Especially if we're not being realists about it. And, you know, and it makes for a punchy book title to just say, well, they are false, and so they're lying to you. But but like I said, I think, you know, if the law of gravity, whatever, right? Like, if or Einstein's theory of relativity, right? Like I know that those are not actually commensurable things, but you're right. Like, to say that those are false, right? When it's like, well, no, we've accomplished tasks with them, right? They, you know, like, much in the same way that I find sometimes, that 2 + 2 = 4 is true. Yes, it is, right? And if you're saying it's not true, then I'm inclined to think that you're thinking about mathematical truth in the wrong way. And that could very well be the case with how we talk about physics and how we talk about, say, if it's being formulated in terms of largely conditional statements, right? Where there's nothing anything actual that's ever being discussed, right? So all of our physical sciences, they're about some possible world, some philosopher might say, but they're not about our world, right? Well, how does that discourse end up being useful, right? And there's one way to say, like, look, it's useful, but it's not true. And it's like, okay, well, I'm willing to bet that if you've put in the work into actually providing the useful account, that really what you've done is offered an alternative semantics for that discourse. And so, I'm like I said, I've just started looking into structuralism, and it's including some scientific structuralism, but it's mostly been in the mathematics side of it so far. But that has, like, structuralism provides the ground rock for looking at something like, let's say, the relevance of mathematics in developing physical theories, right? And then I think I'm interested in exploring that. So I'm looking at that. That's one of the things I'm looking at right now. Is trying to look at more. Well, how does this impact? Looking at, in particular, how does might this impact, or how this might be used to construct, let's say, a response to a scientific structuralist realist position, right? Which would say, like, look, electrons don't exist, but the relationships between whatever that's going on there, that's real, right? Well, maybe not. And so I'm still learning about how to best formulate that, whether or not that's in terms of proposing my account as a kind of eliminative structuralism. But at the very least, it's going to be with the intent of not saying, of affirming the truth of our assertions, especially if they're incredibly useful.
It's interesting going back to what you were talking about earlier, because you wanted to be able to talk about and develop ways of talking about truth outside of the sort of typical correspondence, or however you want to put it. But should I take based on your work that you're more skeptical of realism? Would you say? And do you think that there are? Let me ask you more of a personal question, I guess, in terms of as a philosopher, right? Do you think that the correspondence theory is a bit overhyped? Do you think it's a bit over relied on?
Well, I'll tell you right now, when it comes to the medium-sized objects that I engage with in my day-to-day life, I'm inclined to accept realism. Right? And I'm not, ever going to really deny that, there's some object that I'm holding on to right now. I know your audience can't see, and so they're going to have to make
unless it's a ghost.
Unless it's a ghost, right? But so, you know, um, and I think this is what motivates my alethic and logical pluralism, right? I think different domains have different metaphysical commitments, and I think they reflect different metaphysical commitments. So I would think the domain of discourse in which we talk about the objects that are in my fridge, well, I'm going to be a realist about that domain of discourse, and that's how I'm going to reason about it. Is there a jar of mustard in my fridge right now? Well, I'm willing to accept that is either definitively true or false, right? I don't think that the truth of that statement is entirely dependent on being able to provide a proof of it. Now, I know I may not know the answer to that question, but I'm still confident that it is either definitely true or false because of my realist commitments there, right? And so I'm entirely fine with realism there, right? We might say, with regards, maybe Barclay would hate me, but and I love Barclay and I love teaching
just
Barclay.
In general,
But I'm inclined to be a realist about the empirical stuff, even though I love Barclay, and I think he's way better at trying to make a position argument than Locke, right? But the empirical stuff I engage with, I'm inclined to be a realist about, right? It's when we start talking about the abstract that I'm inclined to go, I don't know here. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be a fictionalist in all of those domains of discourse, right? Like, we've already alluded to the fact that, although I think fictionalism is probably true in mathematics and in modal discourse as well, I'm not necessarily sure it's true in ethics yet, or morality, right? I'm still contemplating that for myself. But being an alethic pluralist and being a logical pluralist and accepting that different domains of discourse have different truth conditions, that's at least a philosophical commitment. That's a way for me to provide some sort of philosophical articulation, at least. So in terms of what we were talking about earlier about just responding to questions, right? That's... Go ahead.
It kind of makes me think of have you ever read any Helen Longino?
No, I have not, but I'm familiar.
Sure. She has a concept called confirmation, which is she sort of uses a sort of success term to describe like isomorphism, homomorphism, truth, approximation, fit, any kind of representational success. She sort of attaches this term.
Is this like verification?
It's not. I don't think she uses it strictly in a verificationalist sense, if that's what you mean. It's more like she in her book, The Fate of Knowledge, she talks about how she sort of talks about some of these issues about like how can you talk about some of these things corresponding in this way, and she makes the point that scientists a lot of the time don't need to and don't want to and don't really look to have that kind of bivalence, right, or that strict correspondence, especially when we talk about, for example, how the law of physics is, the law of gravity is literally false, right? Or Snell's law, for example, is literally false unless you're assuming like certain ideal forms that a fluid might take. You know what I mean? So strictly speaking, it's false, and yet it's still a successful concept. It's a successful term. It's used successfully all the time, and so she's willing to say that is an example of confirmation as a sort of success term. So I think what I'm wondering is, do you it seems like you're almost looking for something similar, kind of an account of success that doesn't rely only on, or at least that it makes room for lots of different ways of talking about success or empirical success. Is that sort of similar to what you're talking about, or is that where you'd like to articulate, or
I'm not sure. what I do think is that we need to be appreciative of the fact that I think that what we mean by is true depends on the context of our discussion. And I think the only determinator so far, I think, anyway, at least this is the idea that I'm pursuing, right, for the time being, that our context is in part informed by the domains of discourse that are in play, right? Right now I'm restricting myself to just that. Rosanna Keefe has a view where she includes much more and develops what she calls a relativized approach to understanding validity. But what I'm looking at right now is how truth is largely informed by the context of our discussion, and in particular, how the domains are informing that context, right? So I think, for instance, in a context in which there's only one domain at play, let's say mathematics, right? Well, we're in a mathematical context, and mathematical truth is at play. In, let's say, a domain that mixes mathematics and modal discourse, where different rules of inference and different sorts of truth are at play, right? Well, now we're in a different context, and there's going to be a different sort of truth appropriate to that context, right? And this is in large part how I think of trying to respond to worries regarding the one we discussed earlier about how do we count for the validity of arguments that mix different accounts of truth, right? Well, my answer to the question of, well, in the argument of wet cats are funny, this cat is wet, so this cat is funny, my response is, well, that argument is taking place in a context that is mixing the domains of humor and realism about cats, and that is prescribing to us a contextual truth to try to understand what sort of truth is being passed along in the premises to the conclusion.
I wonder, just for the sake of greater clarity for both the public at large and within the philosophical discourse, do you think that we need to refine the way we use truth? Maybe talk about truth in a realist context where, we can talk about the truth of tables and stuff, but outside of that, and in most other forms of inquiry where we're talking about anything slightly more abstract, we're never, we'll often use, we're often happy to rely on more and more sort of warranted beliefs or beliefs that we have good evidence or assertions that we can make in respect to concerns about like inductive risk issues, and therefore make a reasonably well-made assertion about this kind of, does the term truth get in the way?
I mean, I think that really kind of depends. I think in terms of trying to think through like validity or something like that, in terms of the conclusion is somehow inheriting something from the premises it was given, right? Or from the premises that we offered, right? I think that's important. And I think that that's an important idea. I just think that what that thing that's being inherited is going to depend on the metaphysical commitments that we're making, right? And so I think one thing, like I've often, I haven't actually really designed any course like this yet, but I've toyed with the idea of trying to design an intro to logic course that didn't just assume classical logic from the get-go, right? Because this is how we all learn classical logic, right? Or I shouldn't say how we all do, but I would imagine that for most people, when they take an intro to formal logic course, well, the logic they're learning is classical logic. Well, what if that course was taught instead with rather than just making that assumption, go, look, here's intuitionistic logic, right? And still introduce the other rules of logic, but also explain, look, here are the reasons why principle of bivalence was being offered here, right? Plato was this wackadoodle who thought that there were forms out there in the sky, right? Like, just like help that to inform the education of how logic was developed and the sorts of influences that go into describing, well, what is a valid inference in a particular logical system or not, right? that metaphysical commitments have such a huge impact on a question as simple as what is the appropriate logic, right? I think is huge, and is not something that is, even for many philosophers who finish an undergrad degree, right, who never know that there's this thing called intuitionistic logic, and it's a competing account of logic, and it's a logic that's particularly taking a metaphysical beef with classical logic, right? And appreciating that, look, these might seem like big philosophical questions, but they have an impact about how we think about things. And the sorts of commitments we make in one area, we might not realize what it has over here, right? And just being able to appreciate this sort of the dynamism of our commitments, right? And the dynamic impact that our commitments can have without us even realizing it, right? And so when you say, is truth overblown? Well, I think maybe classical logic is overblown. And I think maybe we should be spending more time, particularly when we teach intro to logic courses, saying, look, a lot of these rules that we're taking, right? Like principal bivalence, double negation elimination, De Morgan's law, right? All of these rely on commitments, right? Metaphysical commitments in some really deep, profound way, right? And as soon as we undercut those commitments, we undercut these rules of inference, right? And now we have to find new ways to try to get De Morgan's, right? And if we want to still have it, right? And people do that, but I think that's what's overblown. Is this commitment to this notion that there's only one kind of truth, and it is totalitarian and all over and commanding and I think that's the real shame, is that it doesn't appreciate the connection and the relevance of our metaphysical commitments to our the way that we reason about things, right? It's in complete neglect of that appreciation, right? And then so I think that's the real shame.
Okay, so this has been a really interesting conversation talking about fictionalism and how things can be true when they're not literally true, and how being able to talk about those things in lots of different domains can be incredibly useful. And in the meantime, we also got a great account of how to play cops and robbers, right? And a fascinating account of mathematical fictionalism. So this week we had Dr. Phil Bériault. Phil, I want to thank you again for being here.
Thank you again for inviting me, Matt.
Yeah, and it was a lot of fun, and hopefully we'll have you back again soon, maybe sometime. We'll talk about something else. I don't know, maybe.
Hopefully we'll talk about interesting to say.
No, not in philosophy. Not in philosophy. So this has been episode 2. Thank you for joining me and Phil, and we will be back again soon with more episodes talking about more exciting philosophy taking place in Ontario. Look for it. Expect it soon. Okay.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
Alrighty. Bye-bye.